A note before we begin. This audio podcast deals with extremely disturbing subject matter. Murder, sexual violence, necrophilia, dismemberment, and cannibalism are discussed as part of an honest examination of one of the most psychologically complex criminal cases in American history. The goal is not to sensationalize. The goal is to understand as clearly as possible what was happening inside the mind of Jeffrey Dahmer, and why understanding that matters. We will not lose sight of his victims. 17 human beings, with families, with futures, with names that should have grown older. They were sons, brothers, friends. Some were barely men at all. Their lives were not footnotes to a killer's story. They were the story. And as we move forward through the darkness of what was done, we do so with the weight of them in mind, not as statistics, not as headlines, but as people who laughed, who dreamed, who were loved. If there is any purpose in revisiting something so horrific, it is this: to remember them, to confront the truth without flinching, and to make certain that in trying to understand how something so monstrous could happen, we never forget who paid the price. The house on West Bath Road in Bath Township, Ohio, was the kind of house that looks fine from the outside. A quiet suburban property, trees in the yard, a family inside. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on the 21st of May, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was the first son of Lionel Dahmer, a research chemist, and Joyce Dahmer, a teletype machine instructor. By the time Jeffrey was a small child, the family had moved to Ohio, and there the story really begins. Lionel Dahmer was, by most accounts, a decent man. He was also a man deeply absorbed in his work. His doctoral studies in chemistry consumed enormous amounts of his time and attention. He was present in the house, but not always present in the room. Joyce Dahmer was a different and more complicated figure. She struggled with significant mental health difficulties throughout Jeffrey's childhood. She was anxious, depressive, demanding of attention, and argumentative. She was described by neighbours and by Jeffrey himself as a woman who seemed to be in constant distress. At the height of her difficulties, she was reportedly taking upwards of 20 different medications at a time. She would shake so badly from the side effects that she would sometimes fall asleep from sheer exhaustion. Jeffrey, as a child, watched this. He also, according to his classmates, imitated it. He would shake and tremble at school, mimicking his mother's tremors, and the other children would laugh. It was one of the only ways he found to connect socially, through performance, through inhabiting something disturbing and making it entertaining. That dynamic, the use of something dark as a tool for connection, would define his life. Here is something that almost always appears in the biographies of people who become violent predators: an early, intense, and unusual interest in the remains of animals. Jeffrey Dahmer had this from a young age. It began innocuously enough when his father taught him how to preserve the bones of small animals that were found around the property. Lionel Dahmer was a chemist. He knew how to clean and preserve biological material. He taught his son the process as a kind of science lesson. Jeffrey was fascinated, but the fascination quickly outgrew the lesson. He began collecting roadkill, dead animals he found on the side of the road. He would bring them home and process them, strip the flesh, keep the bones. He had a collection of animal remains that he kept in the woods near the family home. He later described enjoying the sounds the remains made when he prodded them, the texture of bones and tendons. He was drawn to the inside of things, to the physical structure that lay beneath the surface. His father noticed the animal collection and recalled it later with unease, but at the time it seemed like an eccentric interest, a slightly odd hobby for a young boy, not a warning sign that anyone knew how to read. Jeffrey also began drinking at around age 14. He later said alcohol was one of the only things that calmed the noise in his head. The compulsive, intrusive thoughts that had begun arriving around that time. Thoughts he could not fully articulate. Thoughts about bodies, about control, about what it would feel like to possess someone completely. He drank to quiet them. The drinking continued and worsened for the rest of his life. This is the part that forensic psychologists return to again and again. The question of when Jeffrey Dahmer's inner life crossed from troubled to something that had no clear category. He said himself, in later interviews and during his confession, that the compulsive fantasies began at around age 14. They were sexual. They were violent. They were about domination. But more specifically than any of those things, they were about a very particular and disturbing desire. He wanted to possess someone. Not just to be with someone, not just to have power over someone, to possess them. In a total, permanent, irreversible sense, he fantasized specifically about someone who could not leave, someone who had no will of their own, someone who was entirely his. Later analysis of his psychology has identified this as a profound and likely pathological fear of abandonment. He was a deeply isolated boy. He had few friends. He struggled to connect. He desperately wanted companionship. And the version of companionship his disturbed mind constructed was one in which the other person had no choice. No agency, no possibility of rejection, no possibility of leaving. This is uncomfortable to think about, because beneath the horror of what he eventually became, there is something recognizably human in the seed of it. The longing for connection, the terror of being left. A version of that longing exists in almost everyone. What is incomprehensible is the direction it took in Jeffrey Dahmer. The way that ordinary human need was somehow channeled into something utterly, catastrophically wrong. In 1977, when Jeffrey was 17, his parents' marriage finally collapsed under the weight of years of conflict. The divorce was, by all accounts, bitter. Jeffrey watched it happen. His younger brother David went to live with relatives. His mother Joyce took David and left. His father Lionel was rarely home, staying elsewhere during the proceedings. And Jeffrey, 17 years old, was left alone in the house on West Bath Road. For extended periods, he was simply there by himself. No parental supervision, no structure. No one checking where he was going or when he was coming home. He graduated from Revere High School in June of 1978. His classmates later described him as a loner. Strange. Present, but not really there. One classmate, John Backderf, who later wrote a graphic memoir about knowing Dahmer in high school, remembered him as a troubled boy whom people mostly kept at a distance. Someone they sensed was off, without being able to say exactly why. 3 weeks after graduation, with the house still empty and the compulsive thoughts that had been building for years now entirely uncontained, Jeffrey Dahmer committed his first murder. On the 18th of June 1978, an 18-year-old named Stephen Mark Hicks was hitchhiking along a road in Ohio. He was on his way to a rock concert at Chippewa Lake Park. He was barefoot because he had been sunbathing. He was carrying a 6-pack of beer. He was, by all accounts, an easygoing and sociable young man. Jeffrey Dahmer, driving past in a car, offered him a lift. He invited Stephen Hicks back to the house. They spent several hours together. They drank beer. They listened to music. And then Stephen Hicks said he wanted to go. And Jeffrey Dahmer said he did not want him to leave. He later described that moment in terms that were almost plaintive. He had been alone for so long. He liked having someone there. He did not want to be alone again. When Stephen Hicks stood up to go, Jeffrey Dahmer picked up a 10-pound dumbbell and struck him from behind. When Hicks fell unconscious, Dahmer strangled him with the bar of the dumbbell. He then stripped the body. He later said he had a sexual response to the sight of the bare-chested Stephen Hicks standing at the roadside, and that impulse had been part of what drove him to make the offer of a lift. He dismembered the body in the crawl space beneath the house. He put the remains into plastic bags and buried them in the woods. Later, worried about discovery, he dug them up, crushed the bones with a sledgehammer, and scattered the fragments in the woods behind the house. Stephen Hicks was 18 years old. He was the first. He would not be the last. But there would be a gap. A very long gap of 9 years, during which Jeffrey Dahmer was not, technically, a serial killer. During which he was simply a disturbed young man carrying a monstrous secret and struggling, increasingly unsuccessfully, with everything else. After the murder of Stephen Hicks, Jeffrey Dahmer's life entered a long, grinding phase of failure and deterioration. His father insisted he enroll at Ohio State University. He lasted 1 quarter. He dropped out. He was sent to join the army, which he did in January of 1979. He was stationed in Germany. His fellow soldiers later remembered him as a heavy drinker and a loner. There were rumours that he had assaulted at least 2 fellow soldiers during his time in the army, though this was never formally charged. He was discharged in March of 1981 due to alcohol abuse. He drifted. He went to Florida for a while. He lived on the beach in Miami. He worked at a sandwich shop. He slept rough. He drank constantly. Eventually, Lionel Dahmer paid for a bus ticket and sent him to live with his grandmother, Catherine Dahmer, in West Allis, a suburb of Milwaukee. And this was where things began again. In Milwaukee, Dahmer discovered the gay bar scene. He had known for years that he was gay. He had never been able to act on it openly. The bars gave him somewhere to go, somewhere he could approach people. But the approach was never straightforward, because what Dahmer wanted from another person was something no consensual relationship could provide. He began, in these years, to drug men he met in the bars, slipping pills into their drinks, not to kill them, not yet, to render them unconscious, because that was what he wanted. Someone who could not leave, someone who was temporarily, chemically, entirely his. He was arrested in 1982 for exposing himself at a public event. He was arrested again in 1986 for masturbating in front of 2 young boys near a river. He was given a year's probation. He was instructed to seek treatment. He did not. And then, in 1987, the killing started again. The second victim was Stephen Tuomi. Dahmer met him at a gay bar in Milwaukee in September of 1987. He invited him to a hotel room. They drank heavily, and then Jeffrey Dahmer woke up. He woke up next to Stephen Tuomi's dead body, and he said for the rest of his life that he had no memory of killing him. He assumed he had done it. He had woken up next to a dead man with blood on his hands, quite literally. But the act itself was a blackout. This is one of the most psychologically interesting and disturbing aspects of the Dahmer case, because it suggests that at least some of his violence was not consciously planned in the usual sense, that it erupted from somewhere beneath rational thought, from the compulsive, fantastical space that alcohol had loosened and his mind had been building for years. He said he found Tuomi's chest had been beaten. He said later that he suspected he had tried to tear into the chest with his hands. He recalled having had a fascination with the exposed chest of an unconscious person. He bought a large suitcase, put the body in it, took a taxi to his grandmother's house, and there in the basement he dismembered Stephen Tuomi's body. He kept the head for a while. He later disposed of everything. He told his grandmother he had been using the basement to work on a project. She did not ask further. After this second murder, the intervals between killings shortened. There was no longer a 9-year gap. In May of 1990, Jeffrey Dahmer moved into his own apartment. 213 Oxford Apartments, 924 North 25th Street, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It was a modest apartment in a working-class neighborhood, mostly populated by African American and other minority community members. He worked at the Ambrosia chocolate factory nearby. He had a job. He had an apartment. He paid his rent. He was, in every external respect, a functioning member of society. Inside the apartment, something else entirely was taking shape. He built what he later described as a ritual. He would go to bars, to bus stops, to shopping centres. He would identify a young man. Typically, his victims were gay or bisexual men from marginalised communities. Black, Latino, Asian. Men whose disappearances, he calculated, would be less likely to prompt aggressive investigation. He would offer money. He would offer the chance to pose for photographs. He would offer a few drinks, and then he would bring them back to the apartment. The drinks would be drugged. He used prescription sleeping medication. His victims would lose consciousness. And then he would do whatever he wanted to them. Sometimes they survived the night and left groggy and confused and not entirely sure what had happened. Sometimes they did not. When they did not survive, the rituals began. He would pose the bodies. He would photograph them. He was building a collection. He kept skulls. He kept genitalia. He kept a blue 55-gallon barrel in which he dissolved body parts in acid. He kept 3 human heads in his refrigerator. He ate parts of some of his victims. He later explained the cannibalism in terms of that same obsessive need for possession. He said that by consuming part of a person, they became part of him. Permanently, they could not leave if they were inside him. That logic is horrifying. It is also, in its twisted way, entirely consistent with the psychology that had been forming since he was 14 years old. The need to possess, the terror of abandonment, the attempt to keep, forever, what ordinary relationships would not allow him to keep. By 1991, Dahmer's inner world had reached a new and still more disturbing level. He had started to believe he could find a way around the problem of death. If the person died, they were gone. Even if he kept parts of them, they were still gone. What he wanted was a living companion, one who would stay, one who could not leave, one who had no will of their own, and he began with the deranged logic of someone whose grip on reality had become entirely distorted, to try to create that. He drilled holes into the skulls of victims while they were still alive. He injected hydrochloric acid or boiling water into their brains. He believed somehow that this would damage the parts of the brain responsible for independent will and movement, would leave the person alive but compliant. A living companion who could not choose to leave. He tried this on multiple victims. It killed them. He recognized that it killed them and continued to try. He was, by this point, conducting what he imagined were experiments. He was operating from a completely collapsed internal logic that had nothing left to tether it to the real world. Forensic psychiatrists who later examined him would describe him as occupying a kind of psychotic space during this period. Not psychotic in the sense of being out of contact with external reality. He still went to work. He still paid his rent. He still maintained the surface. But internally, the world he was living in had become entirely his own, governed by his own rules, his own beliefs, his own brutal theology of possession and control. He was, in those months, killing approximately 1 person per week. On the 27th of May 1991, a 14-year-old boy named Konorak Synthesomphone was found in the street outside Dahmer's apartment. He was naked, he was bleeding, he was stumbling, barely conscious. He could not speak coherently. He had managed, while Dahmer stepped out to buy beer, to escape from the apartment. 3 women found him: Sandra Smith, Tina Spivey, and Nicole Childress. They were alarmed. They called 911. Police and paramedics arrived, and then Jeffrey Dahmer arrived and told the police that the boy was his 19-year-old lover, that he was drunk, that they had had a fight. Paramedics thought Konorak needed immediate medical attention. The officers disagreed. They sent the ambulance away. They helped Dahmer take Konorak back into the apartment. One of the women, Nicole Childress, protested. She was told to shut up. The officers radioed back to their dispatcher afterward, joking about having reunited the intoxicated Asian male with his sober boyfriend. There was laughter on the tape. Konorak Sintasomphone was 14 years old. He was the younger brother of a boy Dahmer had molested in 1988. He did not speak English well because he was Laotian and because Dahmer's drugs had damaged his ability to communicate. Dahmer killed him within an hour of being returned to the apartment. A body was already decomposing in the bedroom when the police were there. If the officers had run a routine check on Dahmer's name, they would have found a registered sex offender currently on probation for the molestation of Konorak's older brother. They did not run the check. 4 more people died after Konorak, before it ended. Glenda Cleveland, a neighbour who had been calling authorities about the smells from Dahmer's apartment for months, made yet another call after hearing about the Konorak incident. She was told again not to worry. The end came on the 22nd of July, 1991. A man named Tracy Edwards had been lured to the apartment. Dahmer handcuffed one of his wrists. For 4 hours, Edwards sat in that apartment, waiting, understanding what was going to happen to him if he did not find a way out. Dahmer, at one point, lay his head on Edwards' chest. He told him he was going to eat his heart. At a moment when Dahmer was momentarily distracted, Edwards punched him in the face. He ran. He got out of the door. He ran down the street with a handcuff still dangling from his wrist. He flagged down a patrol car. He led the officers back to the apartment. They found 3 human heads in the refrigerator. They found torsos in a barrel of acid. They found photographs. They found skulls, preserved and bleached. They found the bones of 11 victims. Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested. He was 31 years old. It was over for him. For the 17, it was already over for. It had ended at different points across 13 years. And for their families, it was never really over at all. Dahmer confessed. He sat across from investigators for over 60 hours of recorded interview and told them almost everything. He was detailed. He was calm. He was cooperative. He was, in the clinical language of the detectives who interviewed him, highly organised in his recollections. He could describe what he had done and roughly in what order. He seemed to want to explain, not to excuse. He told them about the zombies he had tried to create. He told them about the cannibalism and why it made sense to him. He told them about the photographs he took at different stages of dismemberment and why those photographs existed. He told them about the loneliness. He returned to the loneliness many times. He talked about the fear of being left. He talked about needing someone to stay. He was trying, in his fractured and insufficient way, to explain the interior logic of a mind that had spent decades building an entirely private and catastrophically wrong understanding of what closeness was. He was also, at the same time, describing 17 murders. Those two things cannot be separated. The pain and the atrocity lived in the same person, were products of the same person. And the question of what that means, of what it tells us about the relationship between suffering and violence, between loneliness and cruelty, is one that does not resolve cleanly. At his trial in 1992, Dahmer pleaded guilty but argued not guilty by reason of insanity. It was in terms of what the law requires, a meaningful distinction. A person who is legally insane is one who, at the time of the act, did not understand what they were doing or did not understand that what they were doing was wrong. The defense brought in expert witnesses who testified to his diagnoses: borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, necrophilia as a paraphilia, alcohol dependence, a psychotic disorder. Dr. Fred Berlin testified that Dahmer was unable to conform his conduct due to his paraphilia, that the compulsion was, by the time of the murders, genuinely beyond his voluntary control. Dr. Judith Becker added a detail that speaks to the complexity of his inner world. She said that Dahmer had told her he preferred comatose partners to deceased ones 75% of the time, meaning that even within the horror, there was a hierarchy of preference. He wanted the living. He wanted the unconscious. He wanted them to be present, but unable to leave. Death was, in his own psychology, a failure state. something that happened because he could not achieve what he was actually after. The prosecution argued successfully that none of this amounted to legal insanity, that he had planned, that he had concealed evidence, that he had calculated his victim's vulnerability, that he had shown throughout 13 years the consistent capacity to understand that what he was doing was something he had to hide, which meant he knew it was wrong, which meant he was sane in the eyes of the law. The jury agreed. He was found guilty on 16 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 16 consecutive life terms, a total of 957 years in prison. And somewhere, in the part of him that was still a human being, he seemed, according to those who spoke to him in prison, almost relieved. And what he said at the end. Jeffrey Dahmer served his time at Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. He was initially kept in protective custody, separate from the general population. Over time, he was integrated more fully into prison life. He read the Bible, he studied religious texts. He was baptized as a born-again Christian in May of 1994 by a prison chaplain. He wrote letters, he gave interviews. And in those interviews, and in the accounts of those who spoke with him, a portrait emerged of a man who had arrived, finally, at something like genuine remorse. Not performed remorse. Not the strategic remorse of a man trying to get parole. He had 16 life sentences. He was not getting parole. His remorse was, as far as anyone could tell, real. He said he wished he had never been born. He said he would welcome death. He said he thought about his victims every day. He said he could not explain why he had done what he did in a way that would satisfy anyone, including himself. He also said something that his father, Lionel, who visited him in prison and wrote a book about him, found painful and important. He said he believed that if he had found religion earlier, things might have been different, that if he had had something, some structure, some belief, some anchor, to quiet the thoughts that had started at 14, the outcome might not have been what it was. That is not an excuse. It is not even an explanation. It is the reflection of a man looking back at the wreckage of what he was and what he had done, and trying to find something that might have redirected it. On the 28th of November 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer was assigned to a work detail with 2 other inmates. One of them was Christopher Scarver, who was serving a life sentence for murder. The guards left the 3 men unsupervised. Christopher Scarver beat Jeffrey Dahmer to death with a metal bar from the prison gym. He also killed the other inmate in the group. Jeffrey Dahmer died in the ambulance on the way to hospital. He was 34 years old. Scarver later said in interviews given decades afterward that he had made a deliberate choice, that he had chosen to do it, that he had no patience for men who had done what Dahmer had done. Some of the families of Dahmer's victims said his death brought them no peace, that the hurt was worse because he was not suffering the way they were. Some said they felt nothing. Some said they felt relief. Grief does not resolve on a schedule, and 17 murders leave 17 different shapes of absence behind them. Why does the case of Jeffrey Dahmer continue to matter? Not because he was uniquely evil in some supernatural sense, not because he was beyond understanding, but precisely because he is not beyond understanding. Because when you follow his story carefully, you can see the accumulations, the neglect that was not dramatic enough to be recognized, the troubled mother, the absent father, the boy left alone in a house at 17 with no support and a mind already filling up with dark material. The drinking that began at 14 and was never properly addressed. The early sexual offences that were given light sentences and no meaningful intervention. The probation that was supposed to supervise him while he continued to kill. The police officers who took a naked, bleeding, drugged 14-year-old boy and returned him to the man who had abducted him. The neighbour whose months of phone calls about the smell from the apartment were ignored. At every stage, there were points at which a different outcome was possible. Not guaranteed, but possible. And at each stage, the system that was supposed to catch and respond to warning signs failed. Failed the men he would go on to kill. failed the community. Those failures were not random. They were shaped by the racism and homophobia of the time. Most of Dahmer's victims were Black, Latino, or Asian. They were gay or bisexual men. They were members of communities that the Milwaukee police in 1991 did not treat as priorities. That is not speculation. It is on the record. It is in the laughing radio transmission from the officers who returned Konarak Synthsum phone. The intoxicated Asian male was returned to his sober boyfriend. 4 more people died after that night. If one thing had been different, one call taken seriously, one background check run, one officer who looked at a naked, bleeding 14-year-old and thought something is wrong here, I need to find out what. 4 people would have lived who did not. That is the part of the Jeffrey Dahmer story that does not get discussed enough. Not just what was wrong with him, but what was wrong with the structures around him. The systems that were supposed to prevent exactly what happened, and did not. Jeffrey Dahmer was not a monster in the sense of being something other than human. He was human. That is the most important and most uncomfortable thing about him. He was a human being with a profound, damaging fear of abandonment, a deep need for connection, a developing sexuality that he could not express or explore safely, a drinking problem that no one addressed seriously, a criminal record that should have led to meaningful intervention and did not, and a capacity for violence that built year by year, thought by thought, until it became the defining fact of his existence. 17 men and boys paid the price for all of that. They deserve to be remembered as themselves, not as footnotes to the psychology of their killer. Stephen Hicks, 18, hitchhiking to a concert. Stephen Tuomi, 25, met in a bar. Jamie Dockstater, 14 years old. Richard Guerrero, 22. Anthony Sears, 26. Raymond Smith, 32. Edward Smith, 27. Ernest Miller, 22. David Thomas, 22. Curtis Straughter, 17. Errol Lindsay, 19. Konarak Synthsum phone, 14. Anthony Hughes, 31. Matt Turner, 20. Jeremiah Weinberger, 23. Oliver Lacey, 23. Joseph Brederhoft, 25. 17 people. 17 lives that ended in an apartment in Milwaukee. And one man who sat across from investigators and tried for 60 hours to explain something that language does not quite have the capacity to contain. What was wrong with him? A great deal. What was wrong with the world around him? Also a great deal. And how do we make sure it cannot happen again? That question is still open, and it demands an answer that does not begin and end with the man, but looks honestly at everything else, at the gaps in the safety net, at who gets believed, at whose disappearances get taken seriously, at whose children get returned safely to their families instead of to the man who took them. Jeffrey Dahmer is dead. The questions his story raises are not. You've been listening to the audio podcast, Jeffrey Dahmer, Inside His Messed Up Mind. If this episode gave you insight, if it made you think, or helped you better understand the darkness behind the headlines, please like, subscribe, and share history's mysterious minds with others who are fascinated by the psychology behind history's most disturbing cases. Your support helps us continue uncovering the stories that shaped and shocked the world. Until next time, stay curious and question everything. This is History's Mysterious Minds.